Hello, and this is me continuing off from the last video, sort of in the same vein. This is modificationism, a hypothetical world. So it's in the same category as the last one in the sense that it's a world that fits the criteria of life isn't created anywhere because we're trying to, that was the whole point. The difference is Systemcide is the trivial answer to that. The system just dies. Here, the system is kept alive, but through modificationist methods rather than through the creation of life. So effectively, the idea is you cannot create new life, but you can modify existing life, and that's effectively all that you do. So an obvious contender in this world would be immortalism and transhumanism. Take all the people alive today and just keep them alive with some kind of technological means. They're transhumanists, they live forever, they can do whatever, they can change their form, they can transform, they're partly synthetic perhaps. All they really need is just raw energy to stay alive. They choose to do this, and they continue to do this, and existing, no new life forms are created. That's effectively the idea. Although it can manifest in like a whole bunch of ways. You can use some kind of cloning techniques. You can, use metamorphosis techniques on existing life to sort of change their morphology and physiology and structure. And because, because there's no real limit to how far you can modify an existing being, you can modify to the point where it turns into a completely new being, where every individual step is just small changes, but overall it turns into like a completely different thing. Like, say, for example, through modificationism, I decide to give myself like a claw instead of a hand, and then I do something else, give myself another claw, and then bit by bit I transform into a lobster or something. It's like, it's like that, and you can do that, and you can transform back. So, again, it's all, you just have to imagine all of what technology potentially allows for in terms of modifying existing beings, and that's what this is. Now, regardless of whether or not creating new life through whatever means is bad or not, the concept of modificationism is relevant across all hypothetical worlds, because modificationism is something that is, bound to be a thing, and it's something that's bound to happen. Right now, there's no real modification to existing life other than what our physiology already does, which is we age and grow and so on and so forth. Here, we're going to add on new methods of modifying ourselves in very creative and different ways. We will rely less on having to create life to create different things. Of course, I still don't think that the actual creation part is necessarily wrong, but it is something we potentially would rely on less in this hypothetical world. Now, what was I thinking? There are problems with modificationism, especially within the sort of the scope of this hypothetical world where creation specifically is not allowed, right? In a world where creation is allowed, ethically or whatever, modification is just there to supplement it, and it sort of just adds to the complexity of the system, and it's great. In a world where you can't create, but you can only modify, things become a little tricky, because you have to think of how can you do that, and what counts as like fair modificationism, and what doesn't, and at what point does modificationism seep into the territory of creationism. You sort of have to envision a world where, it's like life exists everywhere, but it's created nowhere. That's what modificationism is supposed to be like. And it's very it's a very interesting concept, and specifically if antinatalist types who aren't necessarily interested in Systemcide, what exactly they think of this. The interesting thing is that not allowing creationism disallows certain kinds of modificationism at the system level. Because remember, one point I emphasized in the Systemcide video was that the system itself is a unique living being. So, if the system is a unique living being, how does the system, as a living being, modify itself? Well, it modifies itself by creating, adding to its parts. But its parts are micro living beings, people, you and I, and other organisms. It would be like the equivalent of us, creating new cells in our bodies and stuff. And that counts as modificationism. That doesn't count as creationism, even though technically it is creationism at that level. Right? Well, it's the same thing applies to the system level. For it, modificationism is creationism for us. So there's already like an obvious conflict between creationism and modificationism, is that creationism at one level is modificationism at a higher level. So if we're in favor of modificationism, we have to be in favor of it. At what levels are we in favor of it? Are we in favor of it at our level, or are we in favor of it at the system level? Or are we in favor of it at the system level, but only in certain ways, such that in our level it doesn't actually, creationism doesn't happen. So the system can still modify itself, but not modify itself via creationism at our level. It can only modify itself via modificationism at our level, which it still counts, but it's different. Now, the other obvious thing you could do in this case is cloning. You can clone existing individuals, and that, again, this is like one of those things where the obvious... Let's put it this way. I'm just talking about the obvious flaw with modificationism that I'm going to keep coming back to, is that there's no obvious sense as to where the line is between modificationism and creationism. And then one thing is the difference in how it applies at different levels is already a thing. Am I creating life just by continuing to stay alive because of the cells in my body? Do their interests matter? I mean, apparently not, because the whole the force, the ethical force behind anti-creationism is that you don't want to create feeling beings that can experience suffering. The cells in my body can't. The difference would be that, I guess, in the system, is that the system, for it to modify itself, new feeling beings would have to exist at our level, and which can't be allowed. So I guess it's still consistent in that sense. But anyway, obvious advantages modificationism has over Systemcide. There is, in fact, a sense of the impact of ethical actions within modificationism. Modificationism allows for moral calculus. Systemcide does not. That's the biggest weakness of Systemcide, as I pointed out. If you do Systemcide, you have no idea what you're giving up or what you're preventing. There's no possible way of calculating that. You can only calculate things if you're there to calculate them the entire time, and what you're saving, what you're preventing. Because modificationism requires that beings continue to exist, the system continues to exist. You can always calculate impact within the system, and since the system continues to exist, you can calculate impact of opportunities foregone and things that happen and so on and so forth. It's it's the weirdest thing, but the option of Systemcide is the one, avenue where you have no idea what happens at any level if you take it. It's not that you have no idea what happens, you have no value calculus to what happens. Whereas you do have value calculus with Systemcide, you just have it at local micro levels. You don't have any macro level, or you have much less of a macro idea. Again, it's just due to the fact that if you take the path of Systemcide, there's no way to know what possible worlds could have existed. Modificationism could be a very decent world, but that's still hard to tell compared to other possible worlds. Anyway, so you have that issue. You have a huge advantage that modificationism has. If life ever emerges anywhere, you can still try to control the system, basically. Whereas with Systemcide, you're giving up control, which is, huge turnoff right there. You can continue to control the system. You can continue preventing the creation of life everywhere and the prevention of suffering everywhere to the best, possibility. You can measure impacts the entire way. You just have to follow certain set of rules where you can't create new non-consenting beings from nothing, or the specific methods. There are specific methods that you simply can't use. Now, the disadvantages with modificationism is that by continuing to play the game of life, existing beings, they undertake a risk, because by continuing to live, you continue to, you're under the risk of any sad accident or any possible, terrible thing that might happen to you or other people can happen, and you have to undergo the risk, and you have to undergo it, willfully. For example, going on a mission to Mars via SpaceX, not inconsistent with modificationism, right? You can do that, right? But you undertake a risk. What if you go to Mars and there's all kinds of problems and the people there die or something? It's like, yeah, that could be very miserable, right? So those risks, the difference is they're self-inflicted, so you have to think about that. The other thing about modificationism, so yeah, that's the obvious bad thing, but that's sort of a bad thing with any world that isn't Systemcide. The one situation where the risk is completely negated is specifically Systemcide. What was I going to say? The animal thing. I talked about animals with Systemcide. The thing about modificationism that's better than Systemcide is modificationism is it doesn't, like, again, it keeps all the information within the system. The system continues to exist. So even though new animals aren't born, existing animals either continue to exist, perhaps immortally. I talked about this a little bit in my animal rights video. Transanimalism. We can keep the animals alive, we could design peaceful ecosystems and so on and so forth, so long as no new animals are created. And the animals, they're kept around for sport or whatever, or because we like having animals around, or at the very least, their information is somehow harnessed and we retain it. It's not, we don't get rid of it. So it's not lost. And that's, basic cornerstone of my philosophy is that information loss is a terrible thing. We want to prevent information loss. So the fact that modificationism offers that is pretty good. Now, moving on further, I guess I want to basically talk about, like, modificationism is interesting because I guess what I'm really into here is sort of an exclusionary modificationism where you can modify but you can't create. And that's where the difficulty of this system comes. That's where the drawback shows up, because the simple act of the idea that you can modify existing life in whatever crazy technological way you want, that's perfectly fine. That's great, actually, because that's already something that's sort of ethically in demand within the given system. Imagine genetic engineering to prevent diseases and things like that. It's amazing, right? Okay, or maybe not for the creation of new life, but just modifying your own DNA for an existing being to change certain things about yourself, maybe make yourself more attractive, maybe make yourself have less of a problem here and there, so on and so forth. There's infinite potential within that idea. The thing is, a world where the line between creating and modifying doesn't matter is just an obviously superior world, because you're not you're not worried about that line. You're only worried about whether specific instances of modificationism or creationism are immoral. You're not worried about whether or not there's a general rule to what makes these things immoral. So there's no debate there, and there's no energy lost on that debate. And it's just it has more complexity potential. I feel like the restricted modificationism, I guess, strict anti-creationist modificationism is good, but it's constantly going to be weighed down by where exactly are its limits, and that's the biggest possible weakness. I mean, that is a whole category of debate and science in and of itself, is where exactly do you draw the line. Like, for instance, can I clone myself? Because that's a different being. Hold on. Oh, God, something in my nose. That's a different being, but it's also the same being as me, and that being consents to the process in the sense that I have consent in my head, and the being that's created is an exact copy of me, and they have that same consent in their head. So it's really it gets into an even weirder question, which is like one of the perhaps ethical problems with creating things is that the things you create don't consent to that. Okay, but consent is physical. It's something. It's some kind of brain activity, right? You can manufacture that. So what happens if you can manufacture consent? Is it real consent now? You know, if I create you in such a way where the second you're created, the second you turn your eyes on and wake up, you're like, oh, I consented to being created. Thumbs up. Like, that's not impossible. It's within the realm of, you know, physical permissibility. So where does that actually stand? That can't be wrong. But I think that could still be fucked up because, well, there are perhaps ways in which that could still be fucked up, but not because of the creation itself. Perhaps because of the context of it. So then you have to ask, like, the thing with modificationism, the thing with creationism that's a problem is you're creating, a lot of times it's like you're creating children who don't know anything, and they didn't consent to anything, and they don't really have any sense of what's going on in the world. They don't know life yet. The very act of learning about life could be a painful process in and of itself. And so you're sort of imposing that upon them without any, I guess, without any information that indicates that this is favorable for them at all. Granted, that the whole argument comes down to is that it's not unfavorable either, so I don't think it's necessarily wrong. But that's the issue. So where exactly does that happen and where does it not happen within modificationism? If I create a clone of myself that consents, is that okay? What if I create a child that consents? But, you know, a child that's a child but smart enough to understand what consent is. What happens... There's all kinds of other interesting scenarios. What happens if... I mean, this gets into like a weird thing. It's like, in a sense, creationism is just it's one of two. It's either it's just modificationism over very long periods of time. Like, modificationism over long time spans looks like creationism, you know, because every cell in your body is recycled, everything about you changes. You know, there's a sense of continuity in our heads, qualia, but it's a different being, right? It's effectively a different being by any external measurement. So where exactly is that creationism? Am I creating my future self? In a sense, I am. And in a sense, I am inflicting, imposing things on that future being by continuing to exist and not killing myself right now. That future being might experience all kinds of suffering because I chose to keep going today. However, the difference is that being would have consent because I have consent. So I'm creating him, but I'm manufacturing the consent. So again, it comes back to that. What happens if you create a new being, copy of yourself, but you wipe all their memory, or they have no memory, so they're learning life anew? Now, you might think that that's wrong. Okay, but what if I do that to myself? What if there's a device I can wipe all my memories and just learn life from the beginning again? Is that wrong? Is that wrong? Am I more than my memories? And then maybe, you know, after 10 years or whatever, all the memories from my past life come back, and it's all like, oh, that's what happened. You know, some sort of experiment. Where does that fit in? Because I'm doing it to myself, technically, but the experience of going through life with no memories all over again is distinct. It's almost essentially a completely new person, right? It becomes an amalgam of that new person and the old person after I gain all my memories back. But where exactly does that fit in? And so, you know, there's creating a clone, then there's doing this, which is a little bit more closer to creationism. Then there's, say, because I introduced this element of, like, metamorphosis into modificationism, what if I turn myself into a child version of myself, wiping all my memories so that I could grow up all over again? Just because I want to experience, you know, life as a child again. It's like you've ever had these thought experiments where people are like, hey, if you could repeat high school, or if you could, you know, go back to this, what would you do differently? People assume that you have all the information, but what about just going back knowing nothing? Some people might be interested in doing that because of just the nostalgia, but going back means losing your memories. Is that immoral? You're doing it to yourself, but again, it's technically a different being. Okay, now what happens if you create a clone of yourself, but then you wipe the clone's memories and you make the clone a child version of yourself? how close to creationism is that? Because it's pretty close. That's almost definitely a distinct being. They share DNA with you. Their experience is completely different. Their personality may end up being completely different. But, see, here's the thing. It's not that different from the previous thing where I chose to become a child again, right? It's not that different from that. But it is quite different from just straight modificationism where I, continue to stay alive and impact my future self. Okay, and then the next step from there is like, okay, what if I just created a new being? That's just a child. Okay? See, the whole moral argument against creationism, it happens where it's sort of very anthropocentric. It comes down to like the act of procreation and creationism in modern day is very sort of abrupt. It's very sort of discontinuous. It's like all of a sudden there's no being, then suddenly, poof, there's a being. And it's completely different from both the parents. What I'm talking about is a scenario. Imagine various creation scenarios where new beings are created. But I guess sort of they're in that gray area between modificationism and creationism, and we're just imagine tiny microscopic steps between pure modificationism all the way to pure creationism. Right? What is that? What do those look like? I can modify my existing self, but can I create a clone? That's okay. I could create a clone. Okay, well, what if I create a clone that doesn't have any memories? Okay, well, what if I create a clone that's young and has no memories? Okay, well, what if I just create a new thing? It's like each of those steps might not seem like a very big stretch from the previous one ethically, right? It might not seem like a big difference, and they all might seem reasonable within the purview of modificationism, but it's sort of like it's like the ethics here is not transitive, is what I'm trying to say, because if you take all of these little steps, eventually you'll get to a scenario which is effectively the same thing as creationism. Like creating a clone of myself, wiping their memories, and then changing their DNA, that's the same thing as creating a new being. All the steps are just disjointed. But it's the same thing as creating a new being. Okay? And that's really... Okay, so it's like, what if I don't change their DNA? If I don't change their DNA, does that make it okay? That's just one tiny step that I took away from that. That makes it okay. It's weird, like, why is that the line? And the thing with modificationism, you're going to have shit tons of debates and people just complaining about where exactly this lies if this is the path, this is the world that we go to. That's why I don't think that there's a real line. I think, or that there should be a line between modificationism and creationism. It's just a whole bunch of wasted effort, in my opinion. But yeah, this sort of like, gradual shift in the way you're modifying the being to the point where it looks almost like creationism. Okay, you don't want to wipe any memories then, but then are you allowed to play with memories at all? What if somebody wants to just forget their last 10 years? Are you allowed to do that? Because that's creating a new being, technically. 10 years being wiped, that's a totally... you're going back to your past self. Is that okay? So you're not allowed to wipe memories then. Okay, we're not allowed to make anybody a child. Again, but what if somebody wants to experience that experience again? It comes back to it. Like, there's no... The issue is that none of the individual steps feel that... they don't feel like they're going too far. A person... Creating a childlike being, if I do it to myself, doesn't seem wrong. Creating or at least it might not seem wrong. It might not seem... It doesn't seem wrong to me, but it might not seem wrong to the people alive in general, doing that to themselves. Wiping memories and changing the way memories work might not seem that wrong. But why does it become wrong if you take one more step? Like, at what point, which step kills it? Is it the new DNA thing? Or is it the manufactured consent thing? What if you manufacture consent? Again, it comes back to that. Speaking of which, again, the thing is, modificationism pretty much ends up like a way of cheating around the problem of creationism. For instance, what if I want to turn into a new being? Like, let's say I retain all my memories, right? But my whole DNA and personality and everything changes. All of the context changes, but the qualia is retained. It's okay, and it's more abrupt than just shit that happens over years and years and decades. I go into a machine. There's a machine, right? It morphs my DNA, makes me have new DNA, and changes my personality, but it keeps all my memories. And I consented to the process, and I'm going to consent to the process when I'm the new being as well. So the being before the machine and after the machine both consent to having gone through the machine. Is that wrong? Am I creating a new being, or am I modifying an existing being? In terms of qualia, I'm not creating a new being. But in terms of external metrics, I am. So that's another weird situation where the line doesn't seem obvious. Because in that case, if you're going to say it's like, well, we can't create a new being with qualia, right? The externally we can do whatever. Internally, we cannot create a new kind of qualia. But the problem there is that it's not obvious how qualia works. Qualia doesn't like follow strict rules that we necessarily understand, like because we don't all know the experience of being everything. It's hard to grasp. Like, for example, again, the case where I wipe all my memories, is that a new qualia? It's hard to say, because no one's really necessarily been through that experience. Like, it's like having amnesia. Okay, what if I periodically lose my memories to the point where I've lost all of them, and then I start to gain them back again? Is that creating new qualia, just because it's a step-by-step gradual process rather than an abrupt process? So you get into a whole shit show of debates. Whether or not you can vary things little by little externally, and that counts as creating a new being, whether you can vary things little by little internally, and whether that counts as creating a new being. And my favorite thing about this, imagine a situation where, through modificationist techniques, I can create 50 new beings from one being without creating them in a strict creationist sense. Again, I have the one machine where I turn myself into a different being, where a being, like, one being goes in, a different being comes out, but the qualia is retained. Memories are retained, personality is not, DNA is not, but they remember the experience of being the being going in. Secondly, the next option is, say, another machine that just clones me. And again, imagine consent the entire time. So let's say I create 50 clones of myself, and then each of the 50 clones goes through the first machine, turning into new beings. And there, bam, I created 50 beings from one being. I was the host. I create 50 clones of myself. The 50 clones consented to being clones because they're me. And they were like, oh yeah, sure, I'm going to consent to this. And they're aware, like, let's say we want to populate a new planet or something, and we need new people. And I think, okay, I need new people. I would be okay if I was randomly created as a new person, so I do create clones. All the clones are clones of me, and they're like, okay, I consented to this. I'm okay with this because, I get to exist, and I'm okay with being a new being. Manufactured consent. Then they go through the other machine and turn into new beings, and they consent to that process as well. Why do they consent through going through the machine, becoming new individuals? Because I did. Because I'm consenting to that. And make it more fair, let's say we can all roll some sort of dice to see who has to go through that machine. Because one of the clones has to remain the original me. Because of whole information loss thing. The original me has to stay there. So it's like, there has to be one of the individuals created by this process has to be like the very first individual, because you don't want that first individual to just go away. So either the original host, myself, I could go through the machine and turn into a new person, or one of my I could be the one that stays me and doesn't go through the second machine, or one of the clones doesn't go through the second machine and becomes the original me, and we can have some sort of random number generator select who gets to go and who doesn't. And I'm totally okay with that, because I think it's fair, and it's fine, because we're creating new beings and populating a new planet. And again, every being in this situation consents, because we manufacture their consent, and because they're all beings like me, and I consented to doing the thing and being in the thing. So I consented to hypothetically going through all the machines. So all the clones consented to being created by the machine and going through the second machine, becoming new kinds of beings. And bam, you had 50 new beings from one being via modificationist techniques. And that's totally physically permissible. People might, immediate criticism of this might be like, well, that's just impossible. But it's not impossible. There's nothing about that that's physically, technologically impossible. It doesn't exist yet, but it could exist. Cloning isn't impossible. We know that shit's true for sure. I could easily create 50 clones of myself. The second machine, where I change my personality, again, that happens over time anyway. It'll just happen differently. The tricky part would be changing all my morphology. But again, with transhumanism, you can do that shit. It's not implicitly hard, right? And qualia is retained in that through that second machine, because all of the changes that happen are like they happen gradually. You know, they don't just you don't just die and a new being comes out of nowhere. Your physical body is actually changed into the new being, into the new person with the new personality, and you feel yourself changing. It's like if you've ever done some sort of drug and you feel how, like, you're drunk or whatever, and you feel it's like, oh, I'm drunk now. You feel different internally. Your experience changes. It would be like this. You going through the second machine, you feel your experience changing and yourself turning into the new person as this is happening, and the old person that you were becomes like a distant relative. You don't even know, you don't relate to them as much anymore, but you remember being them. And that's how that would feel, I imagine. But yeah, then you have that. Is that creationism? Is that one of the things that's restricted with the rules of the system or not? See, I would say it isn't, but that just comes back to the whole point, which is that debating where the line should be is just going to be pointless. Which is why, but that's just my opinion on this whole thing. The point is, modificationism without creationism is what you'd have to look at, and you'd have to really consider where the line is between where one is allowed and where the other is not. So where it's okay to modify, or what kind of modifying is not okay. If you modify existing beings in such a way that after a short time they turn into new beings, is that okay or not? If consent was had the entire time. See, it comes back to the fact that I think procreation in the modern day, the way human beings typically do it, the way new beings come into the world typically, just happens to be a process with very little consent in it and very little control in it for the new being. Whereas in all these weird hypotheticals I'm thinking of, it's very easy to manufacture all of that. So, it is what it is. Food for thought. Anyway, that's pretty much it about modificationism. I don't know, the whole character of it, the whole Buddhist character of it. I'm not going to talk about that. I already talked about that in Systemcide. It's a similar thing. I think the difference here with modificationism it wouldn't be that different from, a typical utopia kind of world where we're very technologically advanced and we have access to a lot of information and a lot of different experiences. And that's what we do. And that's perfectly, there's not much more to say about it. Yeah, the character, the Buddhist character thing, I already talked about in Systemcide, and go watch that video. Anyway, that's pretty much it with regards to modificationism that I can currently think of. The next world that I want to talk about is pretty interesting as well, and that will be asexualism. Anyway, cheers.